As most of you are well aware, I have moved to Japan ever since April of this year, and I've had the great privilege of being able to play in tournaments every single day as much as I have time for it, go to tournaments, whether it's shop tournaments or large-scale tournaments or regional tournaments, as much as I want, and as a result, I think I have a pretty good scope over what the Set 6 meta ended up wrapping up to be. Now, the Set 6 meta was very unique in Japan because the WGP season started off in September, actually, and the WGP season this time around is kind of the reverse of the English side, because in English, first you have in the spring you have Team League, which is, the team tournament, and then in the fall you have the solo event, which is BCS. In Japan this year, this kind of ended up being the opposite, where we ended up having solos in spring and now we have the team event in the fall. And one really important thing about the team events in Japan is that unlike in the West, where you just cannot have matching ride lines in a team, in Japan you cannot have the same nation on a team, which is actually really interesting, where you actually have to choose, if you want to win, you have to choose what the best or best deck / best pick is per nation. Because if you choose to play Prison, well then you can't play Gravezorga. If you choose to play Mahar, then you cannot play Overlord, etc, etc. And so a lot of teams are built on several ideas. One of them is just picking the 3 best decks that people think are the 3 best. The other is picking the decks based on how strong the overtrigger is and then choosing the best deck within the nation of the strongest OTs. This is usually Brand, then Dragon Empire, and then the third usually being Keter, usually Bastion. And then the other thing that is very unique about the way that the WGPs work in Japan is that they basically make it so that when they do a top 8 cut, all the undefeated teams go into top 8, and then from the X1s, the only ones that make it in are the teams that do not have clashing ride lines with those that are XO. So for example, if a Prison player is on a team that went XO, let's say in one venue, and you went X1 and you have a Prison in your team, there's a higher likelihood that someone without a Prison that went X1 will be picked instead of you. I know a lot of people in the West don't like this, but personally speaking, I actually don't mind it that much, because it leads to some teams actually completely riding this wave and choosing to build teams of 3 decks that you normally wouldn't expect to do that well, and then as long as the whole team goes X1, they usually will make it into top cut. For example, in Yokohama, there was one team with Token Rambu in it that almost made top cut, which is, something you wouldn't normally see. So anyway, enough of the contextual explanations. Let's sit down and talk about what you really came here for this video. And of course, I'm also this time not, kind of just filming it in this style, because I'm going to be showing a lot of deck lists and talking about cards, so I think, you don't really need to see my face the whole time, and I'd rather have you focus on the actual deck lists that are going to be featured. First things first, though, I want to show you this pie chart, which I think is a really, really good summary of the meta right now. Thanks to Fuzzy Paradox for letting me use this. This is from one of his pie charts that he puts on Twitter, which you should definitely follow if you want to keep up with tournament results from across the world. And so as you can see, overall the meta is incredibly balanced. Like, there are just so many decks and there's so many things that couldn't be in this either. Keep in mind, WGP season also is after Lyrical Set 3, so we will talk about that at the end. But you can see there's still a fair share of older decks, plus a lot of decks that got supported by new promos, whether they're magazine or shop promos, as well as new Set 6 decks are included in here as well. So it's just a really nice distribution, and overall this is just from one of the sides of WGP Tokyo. This is the top cut, but there's just so much diversity and you never know what you're going to run into, even though there is a kind of people do know that the best decks are technically Mahar and Gravezorga and Prison and Bastion, but there are so many decks that are viable right now that it's really hard to say what really is the best. So in today's video, outside of looking at this pie chart, I want to go over a bunch of different decks from various kind of categories and show you what are some of the best decks that you can play in the Set 6 meta, together with Lyrical Set 3 at the end, and how things have shaped up as well. I'm not going to be showing every single deck that has topped, of course. I've kind of picked out 1 or 2 decks per ride line that I'll feature as an example of those that have topped, and these are either ones that have topped in WGP Nagoya or WGP Yokohama or the Sendai Championship. And the reason why I'm also making this video now is because this week we're actually getting Set 7 releasing, and the meta is going to shift quite a lot because of how strong that set is looking to be as well. I think a lot of the decks that we're going to go over today are still going to be very meta, and it's not going to shift them out of the meta, but things like Youthwork, the build is going to change entirely. Leonard's build is going to change entirely. And there are some generic tools in the set too that I think will support some ride lines to maybe rise further to the top. So our first category is actually going to be just a bit of collabs, because you guys in English recently got the Shaman King collab set, and I know a lot of people want to see what the Shaman King deck looks like, and so here you go. This is the best Shaman King deck, which is Asakura Yo. There are quite a few ways to build it, but I think this is one of the kind of cleanest ways to build it. Essentially, you have the Asakura Yo ride line with 4 copies of the trial deck boss, Draw deck boss is really good because it kind of gives you a soft persona ride on top of the extra crit that it gets once you're in like the limit break range. And then you run 3 copies of like the quote-unquote cross ride, which I think honestly isn't as good as the persona ride version, because once you go into this, you're kind of locked into it. Like, you don't want to like re-ride into the old one because then you lose the persona ride power. And then you have the good Asakura-yo rear guard, who's like a big beater, plus it's hard to remove him. Ana for the Vanguard restand, which makes it really hard to actually guard the grade 3 Vanguard because they swing at you with a crit, which you want to guard, but then if you do, they restand and get another crit. Then the Chocolab engine, of course, this lets you peek at your opponent's hand every turn and also just aggro your opponent super hard. That's kind of what this deck is really good at. And then a pretty aggressive trigger lineup because, again, I think this is what the deck works best with. The whole point of the deck is basically that it's really strong on turn 2. The grade 2 Yo itself gets plus 5k, the one of the ride line, of course, and then the Amindamaru gets another plus 5k. So you have like a 28k Vanguard column and then like 23k Choco Love columns slash, you know, the other Asakura-yo columns as well, and therefore you can aggress really hard and on top of that peek at your opponent's hand, which just feels insane, and turn off intercept. So in terms of aggressive strong decks, Asakura-yo is really capable, and I'll be making a more in-depth video about it too, but that's kind of like the rough end of it that you should know. And so this Asakura-yo build is from Murataku. They were one of the players that topped during WGP. Next, I want to take a look at the set 6 decks which are succeeding, and unfortunately it's not all of them yet, but one of the ones that is succeeding and seeing a lot of popularity is of course Youthwork. Now the first Youthwork build I want to show is from Sugar, and this build is honestly very traditional for Youthwork. I want to say this is kind of what most Youthwork builds will look like. You're running 4 of the triple rare for the persona rides, you're running 4 of the gust because you're getting the extra drives. 2 of the garbage check is pretty interesting, but it is pretty good of course because you're drive checking like 3 every turn, so you can actually like give a lot of pressure to that. 2 zests just for when you go first, Schneisels to find the copies of your zests and your gusts, 2 of the Bride because she kind of finds, she's just a 10k shield, like 10k shield is very rare in Overdress and is very good. And the kind of tech slot in this deck is actually the Hex Orb grade 1, which allows you to CB1 when you check a trigger to bot deck at opponent's rear guard. This is really good because of course it's removal, and against Mahar it's going to be very annoying because they will lose their entire Trickstar stack into the bottom deck, which is really strong. So it's just a pretty generic Keter piece that you can kind of put into a bunch of Keter decks. And Youthwork, you know, not needing to have a bunch of grade 3s like Bastion, can afford to play a pretty flexible build as well, and that's why you see so many different Youthwork builds as a result. Now the second Youthwork build I want to show is from Koya from the Gamers Dogma channel, who came second during WGP Yokohama, and his build is way cheekier, and you can see here, still running the same amount of the actual Revolt dresses, but running 3 copies of the Trial Deck Youth because you can also use it as a beater on the rear, and running a bunch of cards that work off of being discarded, so such as the Tholaria, when you discard her you can CB1 Soul Blast 1 to draw a card, and then the Bestida, which is a card that when discarded during your turn lets you CB2 and Soul Blast 1 to choose an opponent's column and bot deck it. So as you can see, both builds are kind of trying to bot deck stuff because of course it's very strong against a lot of decks. You know, Mahar was just one example, but bot decking is a really strong form of removal because you have anti-retire removal, but you don't have like pure resist in that many decks yet, outside of like Jiva right now, I guess. And then you have a kind of recurring resources from just riding all the time in like the Maple, because you have basically 6 persona rides in this build, so the Maple is coming out every single turn. And the only grade 1 is Painkiller Angel, which just helps you find more of your grade 3s and your attackers. So this is a much more cheeky build, but I'm honestly a big fan of it, and I think it might be fun for you guys to try as well. The other surprising set 6 deck that's been finding quite a bit of success is actually Heroes. Now this hero build is by KM, and I'm actually quite a big fan of it. It actually runs a 4 draw and 7 crit, and the thing with Heroes is that you're basically wanting to set the base every single turn and then try to find the heroes to scout into it, and also find the persona right to add to your hand. You have the grade 1 who actually turns on the multi-attacks, but once you see one of her you don't really need any extras unless you're playing against like removal. So then you want to basically maximize your other heroes. So you have like the shield hero, who is really good because he also soul charges and he's a fat shield. You have the removal grade 2, which is really good because she retires virtually anything, which is good if your opponent is cheeky and calls in arcs early, you can get rid of that. Tecton's pretty good in this deck because you want to find your Aegises, and honestly like you do discard a fair bit for the bases themselves, so you can proc at any time. And then choosing to run extra copies of the grade 1 of the ride line I think is actually quite cool, outside of choosing to max the grade 2, because the grade 1 is actually a 13k booster and a very easily achievable one at that, which means that even if you don't go for the multi-attack, it's going to be a strong column, and if you do go for multi-attack, well then it's going to swap into being a 13k attacker that is just going to be pretty good too. And the combined rusher is pretty nice in this deck, although it's not as good as other decks I want to say like Eva, because you're only setting 4 times. That's why some hero players play like a 5th order just to make sure that the combined rusher comes out again. But it's a good recyclable attacker in case you do run out of attackers otherwise. And the final set 6 deck that I want to take a look at that has found some success is Leonard. And so Leonard has been found to be maxing out on the Persona Ride copies. As you can see, 4 of the trial deck and 4 of the booster one. The ride lines also really depend. Like the Rorowa ride line has been quite popular because it basically converts, it makes a token, you can boost with it early, and then you can convert it into another token. It doesn't use soul, which is kind of like the strong part of it, but the Leonard ride line, personally speaking, is also pretty good in my opinion because you can actually use it to make stronger boosters as a result. The thing about Leonard is that you don't actually need to make that such big boosters for the opponent to start wanting to PG it, because just a 15k boost on a 13k body is already going to be making 28 already, which is gonna start getting kind of hard to guard. And you have a bunch of cards that give you that extra power up and like Dianza and whatnot that lets you revive stuff to boost with. And this build chose to like use 8 strong boosters, which are the Dianza together with the Purite. Purite gets like plus 5k if you have 3 or more grade 1 or lower rear guards. And then the last grade 1 is actually the Urgula, because Urgula of course lets you move your stuff around, and I think she's also pretty good because if you put her behind the Vanguard when, you know, your Jeweled starts popping up, she actually prevents your opponent from using your Jeweled, which is pretty cool. And then of course this deck, you know, it already has a very strong Vanguard column, so it needs good attackers. You have the Elenia, who lets you rush basically to call extra cards, you know, early and push your opponent, and as the ride line does not Soul Blast, that's actually pretty good. And then Creed Assault is kind of like the must-have for this deck because it's a 20k attacker, 30k on Persona Ride, and it's just overall a really good card. The nice thing also is that once you've ridden into the booster set rather, Leonard, you can call the other grade 3 trial deck Leonard as a rear, who's an 18k attacker, and so she'll be pretty good because she's usually getting boosted by 13, so you're making like 31k columns just like that, which is also pretty good. And the trigger lineup is also usually pretty aggressive for Leonard. I would personally suggest running the effect crits because you sometimes do need the soul, but I think for set 6 this will be a very nice build to start off with. And so this build was by Matsun. Next up, I want to take a look at some of the decks that got supported by a festival collection and have been finding some support as well. First is Faith's Gravezorga list. Now I actually lost to this Gravezorga list in WGP Yokohama in Swiss due to a miscalculation, but the deck is pretty strong. It goes through the list pretty quickly. You use the doggo to search the orders. You have the grade 1 order that counts 1 to draw 1 and look at the top card of the deck and then leave it on top or discard it. So you filter pretty quickly. You have the grade 2 order that sacks your stuff to countercharge and go to soul, which means that in the prison matchup you can actually like free your stuff even if they have a Perio up and then kill those things and then use that soul that you got from the order to call out more stuff from the prison, which I think is a pretty nice play you can do. But aside from that, you're basically using the order that came with Gravezorga to make really strong columns and then just basically kill the opponent by making them, you know, throw PGs left and right and then run out of guard value. And then we have Ukio's Orphist Regis, and it's Orphist Regis. I think there's been so many different builds for Orphist, but of course I think the must-haves are basically like 4 Nuvorea. Nuvorea is so good. You can make a combo with it where you swing with Nuvorea, then you swing with Orphist Regis on the first grade 3 turn. You can almost want to discard 1, call a Shadow Army token over the Nuvorea, and then Nuvorea sees that and will call another Shadow Army token to their column. So you can basically swing Nuvorea, swing Rear, swing Vanguard, and then swing with 2 more Shadow tokens, so you can actually get 5 attacks out on turn 3 while going first, which is really, really good. Just of course be careful about defensives. Then Koljamid of course is a good booster slash back row interceptor. Kagula, I've seen some lists not even play it, but I think as like a 2 of, it's still pretty good. If anything, would maybe cut an order from this list to make like a space for either a 3rd or a 4th copy of Thumbarino. And Thumbarino is actually very important for Orpus right now because she's one of the only cards that draws. So this deck is really strong going first. It's very, very aggressive, but it's also the kind of deck where once you run out of steam, you run out of steam. And that's just kind of the biggest issue that Orpus unfortunately has and will continue to have for probably quite a while. And now I'd like to take a look at some decks that came out of set 5 that have been supported and have gotten even better. So first, we're going to be taking a look at DF's Eva list. So this guy, no clue who this guy is, but he ended up doing pretty good, came 2nd at WGP Nagoya and went undefeated apparently. Pretty cool. But all jokes aside, this is my Eva list. Eva has been really, really strong. I want to say ever since I managed to make this result in Nagoya, the deck's been popping up like crazy. Like there were so many Evas in Yokohama 2 weeks later, and you just see the deck in shop tournaments a lot nowadays. I think people just kind of realize that this deck is actually really good. I'm not going to talk about the deck too much in this video. I made a 45-minute borderline deck lecture about the deck that you can always check out, and I don't really want to be repeating the same things that I already said there, so please go check out that video I already made about the deck. But Eva, this is just the build in an image. The grade 1s are flexible in terms of the Mamako and the Secondel, as I said in my video before, but please try it out. It's very fun, it's very strong. Eva is love, Eva is life. The second deck from the set 5 ride lines I want to take a look at is Kami's Tamayura. So Tamayura was actually arguably the best set 5 new ride line like on launch, because she just basically is like a Persona Ride 1.5 that lets you swing 5 times, and then the Ririmi Rarami of course allow you to draw more cards and get rid of your opponent's stuff, and have removal that goes to soul. So again, it's actually pretty good because it, you know, doesn't retire. And then you basically use the Barrio Idignil. I think this team, the team that topped with this list, I think their team name was Ririmi, Rarami, and Barrio Idignil. It's like there is a third Direful doll. But the whole point of the deck basically is you're using Folktale to thin out the deck. Barrio Idignil is a good extra attack. The Fox Art is good because it's a Shirayuki in an order. And then you make multi-attacks with Tamayura. And the one new card that got added into this was the Heat Stamping Dragon, which basically says that when your Vanguard attacks, if your opponent has 2 or less rearguards, you put it to soul and give your Vanguard plus 10k. So it makes the Vanguard swing even bigger, so they kind of have to rethink how they guard. And you can kind of like swing with Barrio Idignil, put it to soul, give 5k to this guy going first, swing with him for 15, asking for a 10k shield, and then your Vanguard swings, and this guy goes to soul, you get the plus 10k, and then you open up both front rows actually to give, you know, the full Ririmi Rarami combo to yourself, or just call one card, right, and then basically have the Vanguard swing for 23 on your first grade 3 turn. It just makes that first grade 3 turn a lot stronger, and on top of that, because it empties itself into the soul from the rearguard circle, it kind of takes the place of the old Desert Gunner that we used to run in this. So yeah, Tamayura is pretty good. I definitely recommend picking her up because there's also a good promo coming for this deck in the future, and is going to get support in set 8 too. And then of course the deck from set 5 that I think a lot of people are aware is really good is Blasters. Now Blasters do have a promo in Japanese that's not out in English yet, but it will be in Deer Days. So for those of you that are picking up Deer Days in 2 months time, or a month and a half's time rather, you'll be pleased to know that of course Emmeline will be playable. So if you're planning to use this video as a reference for decks that you can build in Deer Days, then this is a list that you can try out. So this is Bachinki's PBO, and actually haven't beat his PBO yet using Eva either, which basically of course runs 4 of each of the Phantom Blasters. For Emmeline, because she soul blasts 1 to like a top 5 to call a blaster or add it to hand, but then you have to discard 1 if you do. And every time your blaster attacks, she gets plus 5k for the turn, which is really good. So you run 4 Javelins because it's a blaster target, and then only 1 Blaster Dark because you can call it from Soul Alive by or drop from Phantom Blaster Overlord. 4 of each of the grade 3s because if you call them from Emmeline, it's a really good early aggro. And then the spice here is the Blaster Blade. I actually really like the Blaster Blade because you technically don't have any like amazing removal in this deck, because Blaster Dark is good on the actual Vanguard turn because he gets the drive, but on Rearguard Circle it's CB1, pop one of your own rears to pop an opponent's. That's not really cool. Blaster Blade gives you another retire option where you actually get to CB1 and then pop an opponent's grade 2 or greater. I know that he actually changed his ride line from Blaster Javelin into the Marin, as well as the Wingle Brave, which I'm personally a bigger fan of, but keep in mind by running Blaster Blade in the main deck, it means that you will sometimes hit Marin's effect, which means that the Wingle Brave will not call itself out. So this is a good reference PBO list, I think, so feel free to try it out. And then the final list to show off is Natsuki's The End. Natsuki is a good friend of mine, he's a big premium player as well, and so The End basically got supported by a promo, which again should be in Deer Days as well, and the promo is a big game changer. It basically counts as 2 cards when you discard it, and when you discard it, it calls itself to rear and gets plus 5k, so it's just a really busted card all in one. And basically this list, you want to run into the Overlord first, and then right into The End after that, and then The End will have the big restand plus multiple drive check pressure. Neoflame helps to find it, Nahalem helps to power it up, the Bar Ride line helps you find PGs as well as the promo, Fushimachi Madoka is a good booster as well as Guardian, and then the Gojo is a good searchable countercharger that, especially in the grade 3 turn, you can actually use to refund the cost, which I think is very nice. On top of that, Brachio Force is basically just a meta call. Like this card is there to get rid of like Yuika on Kyrie and other annoying grade 1s that other decks play. I guess it's also good for getting rid of the promo in the mirror match. The next section is what I like to call the old guard. So we're going to be taking a look at decks that existed from set 4 and before that, and kind of how they've adapted into the new meta and have used the new cards from set 6 as well as anything else. The deck we're going to be starting off with is Arupaka's Gravezorga. So as you can see, Gravezorga of course is still a very big top tier contender, but the list has changed a little bit. You're still running 10 meteors, but a really good new support card in Combined Rusher has been added to Gravezorga. Combined Rusher, effectively every time you play a set order from hand, you can get almost one to revive it from drop, and when it attacks something that is grade 3 or greater and you have 2 or more set orders in play, it gets plus 10k power. So as long as you keep up a world plus 1 meteor still in the order zone, you will get to get the power up here. But the strong part about this card is that, like, Gravezorga overall has always sorely lacked attackers. Like, the only attackers you have is the Shadow Army token, the 4 Bakubiritos, the 2 Shurgos, and then like if you play Stunner, then you have Stunner. But Combined Rusher is basically a recurring extra attacker they can also commit to early, because like playing Shurgo or Bakubirito early is like, well, you want to play Bakubirito when you can recycle a meteor, and of course Shurgo is when you recycle a bunch of meteors. So Combined Rusher is a really good piece because this way you can aggro early to get your opponent to like a 3-4 damage slot, so that your Gravezorga swings on turn 3 are actually super high pressure. Next, we're going to take a look at Mia's Nirvana list. And this one is interesting because this has been a very recent trend in Nirvana decks of adapting Himena again. So while I personally think that Itsuji is still a 4 of, and I think Trickstar should be a 4 of too, we've seen a lot of lists with like 3 or 4 Himenas purely and just like cutting out the Amelia entirely. Now don't get me wrong, Amelia is still an incredible card that allows you to play second better, but I guess Nirvana players have just been finding it that even if you go second, you can just kind of stick on the Nirvana turn anyway, without necessarily forcing into Mahar, and as long as you get the opponent to 4 damage on the grade 3 turn, and then when you go into Mahar you ping them to 5, it's kind of fine. The only thing you lose out on is that of course Amelia helps to build Soul, but Himena kind of helps you find Espral Idea, which is a card that you cannot search otherwise and just have to draw into with the Arcs, and whether she finds you in Arcs or a Espral Idea, it's going to be good anyway. And of course in typical Japanese list fashion, 4 of the base Farina, because it is just kind of the go-to attacker that you can commit, and it's also an early attacker you can play as well. Next we have Gagaga Shiriusa's Flagberg. Flagberg got some big support in the promo, the Shelling Cannon. This is not a promo that is out in English yet, but it's going to be in Deer Days, so this is a list you definitely want to pay attention to. Basically with Shelling Cannon you can actually make 6 attacks with Flagberg, which is pretty crazy. So you go 2 times with Inlet Pulse, you go 2 times with Ascendance Assault, once with the Vanguard, and then once with Shelling Cannon, so 6 attacks, plus you have countercharge from the Prize Trident rather. And there's also a new order added to the deck as well, which allows you to mill some cards and then call one from drop. So you already have the condensation, and then you have now another form of condensation that actually mills you pieces, which means that you can kind of find the pieces from your deck easier, so whether it's inlets or and stuff like that. And it also costs soul to play, so it's the exact same as inlet, where like you can use the inlet to go to soul and then next turn play any order you have to soul blast it out and call it out again. So Flagberg is just really strong because it has a lot of attackers now. It is still a piece reliant deck, but it feels like they can just keep recurring their pieces, and even with the addition of the Blitz order, they can kind of like, you know, bypass Flagberg's Guard Restrict. The deck is still really strong and it's giving even more support in set 7, so I feel like people should really get used to seeing Flagberg a lot going forward. Next, I want to introduce 2 types of Bruce builds. First, we have Tsukino Waguma's Bruce, which is the kind of typical one that you will see. This is like grade 3 Bruce with some unique takes. So they're playing basically 3 copies of the Jewel Core, which is the grade 1 that you get in the Jewel Trial deck. Now, a lot of lists actually don't play this. Many lists go for just like 4 Protobulb and then 4 copies of the Dober, and then like 3 copies of the Full Dive. But choosing to play Jewel Core actually gives you some early game that Bruce doesn't normally have, because Jewel Core is a 13k attacker that just tucks itself into Soul afterwards, which is honestly pretty strong. Like, it's in a deck that normally has 0 early game, which is very nice. But of course, the main takeaway for this deck is Julian. Like, Julian is an amazing attacker. It is a Leonard that doesn't need to hit, but it counterblasts instead. It soul charges, it makes extra attacks, it's just really good, and it doesn't need you to be in Final Rush, which again gives you some early plays that the deck didn't really have before. So this is kind of what grade 3 Bruce looks like, and it is one of the really strong decks right now, but you do need to pilot it really well, because if you don't know how to navigate the early game, like I don't, you will simply just die. However, there's also a hybrid Bruce that's been popping up, and this one is from Ina, and so they play the grade 4 Bruce with a couple Julians in it, which gives you some stuff to do on turn 3, still playing Marjorie's, playing the Festival Collection grade 2 that kind of gets extra 10k every time that she attacks, as long as you're in Final Rush, and of course the Lyle is in here for the like extra calling in the main phase. So it's like a really cool hybrid list. I think we've seen a lot of the hybrid popping up recently in the West Western side, but I haven't really seen in Japan as much, which is quite cool to see. I don't know if this is the perfect hybrid build, but it is a cool thing to explore. You know, grade 4 Bruce isn't dead, and it's kind of hard to say which version of Bruce is actually better. Up next, we have Nuki's Bastion. Bastion has not changed at all. I just wanted to show a build. This is one of the lists that you can run, which still runs one of the Dark Strain because it's limited. Some lists actually run some of the form-up orders still as well. I think Murutai actually got top 8 in Yokohama with a build that ran the form-up order too. There's not too much to say about this, but I just wanted to show that, you know, Bastion is still here and just running a bunch of Bastions in both Persona Ride as well as grade 4 form. And then a list that surprised me a bit is Yachio's Bafsagara. So Bafsagara is still doing some good work. We did get the promo, the Shadia, which searches Trick Moon and puts it to the drop. Only running 1 copy here, so basically like a 5th copy of Trick Moon, playing 3 Travis, 4 of the Aoshinya, which is the grade 2 from Festival Collection, which is a really amazing card, letting you be a 20k attacker and can almost want to bring back a Trick Moon is really strong. The weapon lineup is actually very streamlined, and this is kind of the weapon lineup that everyone runs here, which is 1 sword, 1 shield, 4 spears. You basically treat the spear as a grade 4, so you know how grade 4 decks have to mulligan heavily for the grade 4. Basically in Bafsagara, you first prioritize getting the spear, and then the Trick Moon, and then the Persona Rides and stuff like that. So the spear is very, very important, but the sword is honestly not used that much. Like, it costs CB2, and now the deck has so many better things to use that Counterblast on. So Aoshinya is one thing, but in set 6 we also got the Shabuda, which in drop, every time you call something from your drop to rearguard circle, if your Vanguard is Bafsagara, you can almost want to call this out as well. So it's a grade 2 that for CB1 brings itself back, and it's also a 15k attacker, so this way you can just kind of like save hand and not have to call out attackers as much, and you can just, like, you know, bring back Trick Moon or bring back the grade 0 crit, for example, from Bafsagara skill or the Aoshinya skill, and then the Shabuda is going to bring itself back too. So overall, I'm a big fan of this build. I'm going to be trying this out myself. Although there's a lot of Bafsagara support in set 7, so it's going to change even more. And finally, I really wanted to show off Uzumi's prison list, because this list is really interesting. Uzumi wrote a pretty long blog about his performance. He came top 8 in Yokohama with this. It's a list that actually plays 1 Persona Ride as, you know, a beater slash a Persona Ride that you can go into, and it turns out that actually Uzumi doesn't play the prison on turn 1 sometimes, because they only play 4 copies of the Chevalstad as the only grade 1. They don't develop the back row much, and if they go second, they can just kind of wait until turn 2 and then have more targets to call down to rest for the prison, and that way you don't let the opponent's Soul Blast want to get an early attacker out, because this deck is really weak to aggro. So actually, by using this hut pink, when you go second, you give your opponent the ability to put an attacker to prison and call it out and bash your face in. And they also use the soul, which you want to be stealing away from them with Pure Light. So if you go first, it's cool to rest the Vanguard and set the prison, because of course, like, you're not losing anything out from that, and then even if they use the soul to call out an attacker on turn 2, it's not going to be as bad as if they use it going first. But going second, it's actually quite worth to wait a little bit and actually skip on the Reset Pink effect. So I think it's really interesting, and I think there's a lot of things you can learn from Uzumi. They're an amazing player, and just overall someone that I'm a big fan of. And the last of the old guard that I think is a very interesting deck to talk about is Barrow Magnus. So this list is from Soul Dealer, and you'll notice that there's quite a few cool things about this deck. One thing is that we're running the Flaming Pony in the Ride deck. So this card allows you to bind it from the Soul to Soul Charge 2. So basically, once you ride over it, you can just kind of, you know, bind it out. And the reason why is because we're running the Amandine. So Amandine is a new triple rare in set 6, who, when you have 10 or more soul, is a plus 10k power continuous, so she's an 18k attacker on her own, slash booster, by the way. And once per turn, you can counterblast 1 to make it so that every time you use an effect to soul charge, the soul charging count becomes +1. So you can use her and then immediately use the Flaming Pony in your soul to bind it and then soul charge 3 instead of 2. And you can use this multiple times if you've soul charged multiples. Same thing goes for the Curtis, it becomes a soul charge 3 now. And so basically, thanks to this, it's become really easy to build up the soul for Barrow Magnus on turn 3 already. And of course, the Swirlers get even more soul because calling a Swirler soul charges 2, which means that it gets plus 10k immediately. And so Barrow just become a really scary deck because it's just so fast. And then finally, I want to spend a bit of time talking about the Lyrical decks. First one is going to be Ayrton's Kyrie. So this is one of my teammates, and he actually made a deck profile video on this too. This is a more combo-oriented Kyrie using Yuika as well as Arche to kind of like have beefier columns overall across the board, and also just like bounce stuff like Melty to reuse the effect. There are so many different ways to build Kyrie, whether you want to take it more in the friend direction, or if you want to take it more in the combo direction, or into like the heavy attacker direction. I did a video explaining why Kyrie was so good in set 2 already, already, and a lot of the points still stay, but now basically with the addition of Yuika, as well as some of the other friend cards, the deck has just become even stronger. But at the same time, it's still a piece-reliant combo deck, which surprisingly has been struggling to perform that much in Yokohama. It saw a lot of success in Nagoya, but honestly, ever since the Lyrical Set 3 release, the other Lyrical decks have been finding more and more success, and Kyrie's actually been dialing down bit by bit. Speaking of the decks that are seeing more success, we have Hazerit. So this list is from Morgana, and basically Hazerit's strength is that she's kind of like Spike Brothers, but in Lyrical. So her whole gimmick is just making it so that everything attacks, you get multi-attacks, they go back to deck, and then you get more attacks out after that. And everything gets a power up, and you have like counter charges and just a bunch of really strong effects. I sadly haven't actually played against this deck myself yet, so I'm kind of lacking information on it, but it's really, really strong just because of that kind of Spike Brothers premise. The deck that I personally think is the strongest of Lyrical right now is actually Michio. So this is Parioji's Michio deck, and what's really cool about Michio is that it doesn't actually play any of the super expensive staples. Like there's no Maple, there's no Yuika, which is really, really good in my opinion. How Michio works is that you have the grade 1 order that essentially allows you to play orders for free. So you like bypass the once per turn order count that you can play from hand, which then plays a grade 3 order, which lets you draw cards every time you play it. And then you can also make it so that when your Michio Vanguard attacks on turn 3, you can give plus 10k to 3 units. And then Michio can power up her partner Nokuno, and Nokuno actually becomes your Vanguard at the end of the battle that your Vanguard attacked. So you basically twin drive with Michio with a 31k column because you give plus 10k to Nokuno and then your 2 other front rows. And then Nokuno becomes your Vanguard, she's 18k on, for Sunrise it's going to be 28k with a single drive. And because your Vanguard becomes grade 1, that means that the front triggers and draw triggers lose their defensive ability. So you're triple driving every turn and powering up your board immensely. And on top of that, you have a bunch of ways to recycle orders as well as play orders from drop that you used. And on top of that, there's a really cool generic card in Aura, who when she boosts and the attack hits, you can retire her to search your deck for an order card, reveal it, add it to your hand, and shuffle your deck. This card can also search the Blitz order, which means that you can actually search out a PG in this deck, which is pretty nuts. And then if you already have it in hand, then you can just search out more of the grade 3 Michio order. The deck is really strong and I highly recommend trying it out. There's quite a few different ways to build it too, but this build is actually a really good one to start off from. Next, we have Mirai's Kyoka. Kyoka is a really strong deck as well. It effectively has a good grade 2 restanding rear. You can use Melty to draw into more cards and use Irene to kind of like top deck check. But above all else, the Lyrical Shooting Stars magazine order allows you to even play it on turn 2. And basically, if you have 2 or more grade 1s on the board, you draw 2 and then discard 1. If you have 2 or more grade 2s on the board, then you give a unit plus 10k. And if you have 2 or more grade 3s on the board, you countercharge 1. So you don't really care about the countercharge as much. You can just use the first 2 effects to draw extra cards and give one of your restanding attackers the power up. And giving it to the Ache means that at the end of your grade 3 Kyoka's attack, you can CB1 Soul Blast 1 and restand her. So she already gets plus 5k from her own effect, gets extra power from the magazine, and then gets another 5k from Kyoka's effect. So she's honestly really, really powerful. And then if you actually end up playing all of your Lyrical Shooting Stars from hand, you could then use the Yennefer to play it from drop instead. So you kind of never run out of steam in this deck. It's crazy. And the final deck to talk about is Lutetia. Lutetia is another really strong contender for Lyrical. She is basically a Dragonic Overlord that draws a bunch of cards and also has a Blitz order that is nice and defensive. Setting up the Blitz order's condition is also pretty easy in this deck, but I still surprisingly have not hit this deck in tournaments or really seen it in play too much. But it is actually one of the highest rated Lyrical decks from the new ride lines, so you should expect to run into it pretty often. And that is it. Those are all the decks that have been performing well throughout the WGP season here in Japan, together with Set 6 and Lyrical Set 3 combined. The meta is super diverse, and I feel like it's going to get even more diverse with Set 7, and I think Youthwork is going to break out into the top meta of the grade 4 decks in my opinion because of how good Tempest and the grade 1 Witch they got is, or are rather. I hope this video has been a good reference point for you guys that are trying to play competitive for the BCS season after Set 6 becomes legal. And for those of you that are picking up Gear Days, I hope this is also a nice kind of checkpoint to look back on for both the like Set 5 and below decks, but also for the decks that have like really good promos that will be in the base game. And of course, when Set 6 gets added with the DLC, as well as Lyrical Set 3, you'll be able to reference these decks too. So I hope this video has been very useful, and I'm sorry it's taken quite a while for me to get it out. I plan to do more of these and just kind of break down the WGPs / Chiho Cups, like the regional cups, one by one instead of having to like compile a bunch of things into one video. So I think we'll try to look at this whenever there's a major event and just break down any of the particular decks that stand out, especially with Set 7 coming out and there being a new meta. Anyway, if you liked the video, please do give it a like, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe. I'm also very active on Twitter, so please do give me a follow there. And if you want to interact with the community more, feel free to check out my Twitch channel as well as join my Discord. All links are in the description. Also, if you want to check out any of the decks, I will leave the deck logs in the description, but keep in mind they are in Japanese. But anyway, that's gonna be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.